Hello learners and welcome to your natural sciences lesson. So today we're dealing with acids that are reacting with metal hydroxides. But then before we start, did you know the following? That the metal hydroxide that we're talking about, they are actually bases, or they make bases. Now, for us in this entire lesson, we need to set goals so that we need to be able to achieve them. So the first goal that I want us to achieve is the following, that by the end of the lesson, you should be able to balance the chemical equations, that's number one. You also need to be able to identify salt and water as the products of an acid with a metal hydroxide. You also need to be able to state the general equation for the reaction of an acid with a metal hydroxide. And then lastly, you need to be able to predict the name of the salt when an acid reacts with oxides or hydroxides. So when an acid reacts with an oxide or a hydroxide, you should be able to predict the salt that is going to be formed as the product of that reaction. We are going to break the main concept into two small concepts that you're going to be dealing with throughout the entire lesson. So the main concept says that we are going to be looking at the general reaction of an acid with a metal hydroxide. Then that concept broken into two, we are first going to start by looking at the metal hydroxides as what they are and what do they do. And then secondly, we're going to be looking at how do we predict the name of the salt when the reaction of an acid and the metal hydroxide is taking place. However, I know that there are certain things that we know about this lesson. So I know that you know the following things, that number one, all acids can be identified by the H, which is the hydrogen atom that is in front of a molecular formula. So all the molecular formulas of an acid, they have an H in front of the molecular formula. For instance, we can look at HCl, hydrochloric acid. There's an H in front of the molecular formula. Also, number two, bases have a pH above 7. So now this now takes us back to the pH scale, that it ranges from 0 to 14, and then there's a 7 which is in the center in the middle, whereby all the substances that have a pH of 7, they are neutral. Then below 7, those are acids, and then above 7, those are bases. So bases have a pH that is above 7, and then, bases have a pH that is above 7, and then acids have a pH that is lower than 7. And we know that at 7, the substance must be neutral. Furthermore, the product of the reaction between an acid and base is salt and water. So whenever we are reacting an acid and a base, the product is going to be the salt and water. However, the pH of the product depends on the strength of the particular substances which we are reacting in the beginning of the reaction. So the product of the pH, or rather the pH of the product, depends on the relative strength of the acid and the base. Now, by that we mean, should we have an acid that is of high pH with a base that is of low pH, then the product will be dependent on the strength of either the acid or the base. In that particular case, the product will be more acidic because the acid had a pH that was greater than that of the base in terms of the strength. That means now, when we are looking at the pH from 0, 7, and 14, the further you move away from 7 towards 0, the strength of the acid increases. So if we are reacting an acid that has a pH of, let's say, 1, and then we are reacting a base with a pH of, let's say, 8. Now again here on the base side, whenever we're moving away from 7 going towards 14, the strength increases. So now that means the strength of this acid is much higher compared to the strength of this base. So whenever we are reacting an acid that has a pH of 1 and a base that has a pH of 8, then the product will be determined, the pH of the product will be determined by the one that has a greater strength. In this case, it is going to be the acid. So the product is going to be acidic as compared to it being basic or neutral. So with what we know, can we then be able to answer the following questions? The questions that we are given are as follows. That we need to write the general acid-base reaction equation. We do know that whenever we are reacting an acid with a base, the products are going to be salt and water. So the general acid-base reaction is going to be acid plus base will react to form salt and water. Now the second question says, when a metal hydroxide reacts with an acid, a salt and something will be formed. So when a metal hydroxide reacts with an acid, we know that the acid is going to donate its hydrogen that is in front of the molecular formula. And then the hydroxide is going to donate the OH, and then that OH mixed with or combined with the H will form the water. So that means the remainder is going to be forming the salt. So the reaction between a metal hydroxide with an acid is going to form the salt and then the water. And then lastly, how can metal oxides be formed in general? So how do we then form metal oxides? We know that the metal oxide is basically now a reaction of a metal plus oxygen. So the reaction between a metal plus oxygen is going to give us the metal oxide, reacting to form metal oxide. So that is going to be our chemical reaction. So this is O for oxygen. So throughout this lesson, to better explain the concept of the reaction between an acid and the metal hydroxide, we're going to be making use of these following words. For instance, we're going to be making use of acid, base, and pH value to better explain what you're going to be talking about. So an acid, by description, so describing an acid, we're saying that that's a substance that tastes sour and feels rough on one's finger. But we're not advised to feel an acid because they are very corrosive. Now, a base, also a substance that tastes bitter and feels slippery. Same with the acid. We are not going to be feeling the acid. We're not going to be feeling the base. We're also not going to taste any of those two substances because they are highly corrosive. For you to know if whether something is an acid or a base, we use an indicator to test the acidity and to also test the basicity of the substance. And then lastly, the pH value. Now, that's now a measure of acidity or the basicity of a substance. So the pH value coming from the pH scale, that number that you're talking about is basically a measure of the acidity or the basicity of a substance. So before we start with the first concept, we're just going to quickly go for a short break, and I will see you just after this.